I've been thinking recently about how Sonic Riders actually still goes way harder than it ever really needed to. This spin-off racing game released in 2006 was way more than just a mandatory Mario Kart clone with Sonic characters. Hardly a cash-in like an M&M kart, or Garfield kart, or Pac-Man World Rally, or, even Sonic Drift. Like, this is big budget in comparison. Hardly something they just threw together to try and siphon some of Mario Kart's market share. To me, Sonic Riders remains crystallized in time as a wonderful way to feel what the early to mid-2000s were like for video games, with a lot of era-specific stuff turned up to 11. In some ways, I think it represents the end of an era as well, and its celebratory, maximalist tone is a great way of representing that. But what is Sonic Riders all about? Well, it's essentially a combo of Mario Kart and SSX-style extreme sports titles. It shares some DNA with Sega's Jet Set Radio as well, which is a title I look back fondly on as capturing the zeitgeist earlier in this era, even if, unfortunately, it wasn't a runaway success compared to stuff like SSX or Tony Hawk's Pro Skater. Sonic makes sense to transfer to a racing game because speed is key to the ethos of the character. However, before Riders, the racing titles we had gotten included Sonic Drift, which put Sonic into cars for a primitive Mario Kart crossed with Outrun handheld experience. This one has a sequel too, but neither of them are very good. There's also Sonic R, of course, which said forget the cars and let Sonic and friends race on foot instead, which was novel but not totally satisfying to control. At least the Europop soundtrack was pure cheesy heat. Riders put Sonic and Friends on hoverboards, colloquially known in the Sonic universe as Extreme Gear. A hoverboard seems like a natural choice for Sonic, since it's not as physically limited as a car or some other kind of bulky vehicle would be, and allows you to transfer some of the acrobatic fluidity of Sonic into the racing format. Sonic Riders feels like the natural conversion of Sonic Adventure-style 3D platforming, cooler and cool attitude, and big wow moment set pieces into a racing blueprint. It's like a spiritual sequel to the opening of Sonic Adventure 2, where you skid down San Francisco sending hundreds of cars flying. We first get a look of this game in this sick little anime opening movie, which is such a killer way to start things off. The art style used for the character illustrations is really slick, with these shaded shadows. It's quite a lot of flair. Like this rainbow wave here is a memorable image as well. I've always really enjoyed the art style for this game, and the poses the characters are popping off in the illustrations are kinda banger. We all know this era of Sonic was peak for poses that go outrageously hard. But yeah, this opening movie with its electro rock song, accompanying the stylish art style, kinda rules. This era of games would have a bunch of sick animated or CGI cutscenes heavily compressed to fit on a disc at the time. Killer 7 is another notable one from this era with its compressed anime cutscenes. Crazy that they spent so much money to get these produced, only for them to be compressed so much. Back in 2006, these CGI cutscenes they used to open up story mode as well were pretty much realer than real life to me, despite the GameCube compressing them down to 480p. Generally, the skeleton of this game is similar to Mario Kart as you race 7 other characters around a racetrack over 3 laps. Along the way there's item boxes to collect, you have to drift around corners, and you can access various shortcuts. Though no blue shells in sight, luckily. You boost, do tricks off ramps, and different characters have a class of speed, flight, or power, which opens up specific paths and shortcuts for them. Speed class characters can grind on rails, flight class can use these dash rings, and power characters can crash through certain obstacles. As such, your chosen character will be integral to what different approaches you can make on each track. It's a bit less cut and dry than a lot of other racing games in that regard. Something you'll probably immediately encounter is that this game has quite a steep learning curve, especially for a game series that's usually quite easy to figure out and marketed towards kids. Sonic Riders does have a video tutorial, but it's hidden in the menus, and while it is solid at teaching you the essentials, it could have been better if it was interactive. Suppose back in the day we'd be able to read the physical manual that came in the game box to figure stuff out. Basically, without some semblance of outside help, there's a bunch of mechanics in Sonic Riders that are hard to figure out. And nowadays, unless you manage to play on original hardware, which can be quite hard if you're not rich, then you're relying on this one video in the game and the internet to get you clued up. Essentially, the core of Sonic Riders is a risk-reward system. From the beginning of the race, this is in place with a starting lineup mechanic that is sure to mystify new players. Before the race starts, you have free reign to pace up and down the lineup, though there's an electric barrier in place that prevents you from starting the race until the exact moment the countdown finishes. So the first risk-reward system in play is timing your run-up to be as close as possible to the moment the electric gate opens. The risk? Getting fried if you mistime your run. The reward? A silky smooth start to the race that gives you an early edge up on the competition. This is a system that's admirably inaccessible. If I would introduce friends to Sonic Riders as a kid, this is immediately a mechanic that would confuse them. I don't think I've ever seen any other game with such a mechanic either, so it might be relatively unique. But really, once you're familiar with it, it can become a really satisfying system to pull off. If you compare it to Mario Kart's similar starting boost mechanic, this one is far more rewarding, as the timing is a lot more precise to master, whereas Mario Kart only takes a few tries to figure out and memorize usually. You can also get intimidated by this game's HUD, which is kind of maximalist and features some information that is hilariously inessential. Like when you launch off a ramp and do tricks, it will display the degrees of the turns you're doing, It's funny because they're kind of just throwing this information up for the sake of it, and I can't lie, I do like some ridiculous numbers popping up on the HUD. Like, to be honest, it doesn't really matter that I know what these tricks are called, and it certainly doesn't matter that I take note of the angles of my tricks. These tricks, by the way, are key to the game as well, and play back into more systems of risk and reward. There's a bunch of ramps and ledges on every level that you can jump off of, and then chain tricks together before you land. The first part of the trick system is that to get the best air, you'll want to charge up a jump before releasing it at the optimum moment. Of course though, you can't charge the jump for too long or you'll lose speed. It's another timing-based system that's fun to try and master. Then after jumping, you chain together tricks by flicking the control stick in different directions. You'll want to chain multiple together before landing cleanly, meaning that if you're in the middle of a trick when landing, you'll mess up, lose speed, and gain no reward for getting a good trick rank. You're notified by a big fat C rank on the screen. Also, Omochow, the annoying tutorial robot from Sonic Adventure 2, is the announcer, and he'll get revenge on you for all the bullying you probably did to him in that game by roasting you in this one. So launching off of ramps and doing tricks is like a dual-layered risk-reward system. Not only this, but you can access shortcuts off of certain ramps if you specifically choose to front flip or back flip off it, adding another variable. All of this goes to show how Sonic Riders is actually quite tricky to figure out. Like, this extra mechanic of front or back flipping is totally absent from the tutorial video, though it is mentioned in the game's manual at least. Another big aspect of this game that might throw newcomers off is the air system. This is a meter that represents your board's air power, which depletes naturally as you race. This meter also works as your boost too, meaning you can spend some of it to dash forward. The meter can be replenished by landing tricks and through item boxes. There's also some parts of the track where it refills automatically as you're thrown into an autoplay set piece. If the meter runs out, then your extreme gear no longer hovers and you're left to run to a pit stop to refill. This mechanic leaves you feeling naked as you'll get overtaken and slow right down, especially if you chance things and presume you'll get some air out of an item box but end up with some rings instead. The first few times you race, you'll probably not think too much about managing your air levels, and you might end up running out. But once you're attuned to the game, it's something you can let sink into the background a bit more. Again, it's an element of risk-reward where you will weigh up the value of boosting in front of opponents over the amount of air it will take from you, and whether you'll find a chance to refill the meter naturally before running out via some tricks or chancing an item box. Briefly, we gotta mention the soundtrack too, which is really great, as Sonic games pretty much always are. Whatever game series has music input from the holy trinity of musicians, Michael Jackson, Bowling for Soup, and Kellen Quinn. It combines big, loud, arcadey beats with unique touches for each racetrack, which all have a particular vibe. I really have fond memories of this 90s and 2000s era of arcadey electronic music that often strayed into jungle or drum and bass. Metal City as arcadey trance paired with whimsical synths. Splash Canyon is ready-made to feature in those PS2 era breakbeat videos that I keep seeing popping up in my recommended videos. There's some rapping in this track which has cryptic lyrics. I love when he shouts, "Jet Bird!" Only if you can. Jet Bird, coming at his son. There's even an alternate version of this song which straight up, no joke, sounds like Death Grips. Something cool about this game is that they've included a story mode. It works a lot like Sonic Adventure 2's, where you'll have a hero and a dark story, only instead of Shadow and Co, the villains are the newly introduced Babylon Rogues. These guys are like Funhouse mirror versions of Sonic, Tails and Knuckles. So there's Jet the Hawk, who is basically the Shadow the Hedgehog design philosophy taken up to another level. He's basically Green Sonic, but they've made him a bird to further make him a distinct design. We already got edgy Sonic with chest hair, now we've got edgier Sonic who's louder with even more chest hair. He also sounds like a Power Rangers villain, which is fun.
Not bad. I admit you're pretty fast on your feet.
There's something about this kind of voice acting always cracks me up, like nobody speaks like this in real life. Wave the Swallow is a Tails analog, and she has a cool design. Like bro, check out her Guy Fieri-esque flame trousers. Do you think a pop-punk skater girl could fall in love with a new metal homeboy? Then Storm the Albatross is a big dumb guy mirror of Knuckles. Like put these two in a room together and you just know they'd be yapping about the stupidest shit you could ever think of. Shadow and Rouge are in the game as extra playable characters but don't play a part in the story. Inevitably though, Amy Rose and Dr. Eggman each play a part. I think the plot here is honestly decent. Like obviously it's Sonic the Hedgehog and it is kinda dumb and silly, but the tone feels on point. Like Sonic Adventure 2's ridiculous, almost shonen-type plot is mixed with sports anime levels of over-the-top rival banter. For a spin-off racing game, it goes above and beyond what it needed to. This time, Eggman's plan is to once again collect all the Chaos Emeralds for his own game, which is to obtain the treasure in the Garden of Babylon, but his way of obtaining them is a bit convoluted. He secretly allies himself with the Babylon rogues, and then sets up an Extreme Gear racing tournament with a Chaos Emerald as the entry ticket. So his plan is essentially to get all of the emeralds in one place through the tournament, then bank on Jet winning because he's the Extreme Gear GOAT. Then Jet can use the emeralds to make the Babylon Garden appear, and Eggman will then leapfrog him to get the secret treasure. To be honest, it seems like an absurd plan, and it banks on a lot of things outside of his control, and also for Sonic and friends to give him the benefit of the doubt. Like we know Eggman's up to no good and just wants the emeralds for his own gain. Why is Sonic and the gang even enabling him? I guess they're just in it for love of the game at this point.
How can she just walk in and diss Tails?
I know, and tinkering's all he's really good at, too.
Damn Knuckles, bro, aren't you guys supposed to be buddies? Story mode is just a Grand Prix with cutscenes in between essentially. Pretty simple, but the AI are fairly tricky here. There's some fun moments within a ridiculous plot, definitely worth a look. I do enjoy these effects they sometimes use in the cutscenes. They feel like default plugins. Hold up, look, I can make it look even better.
I lost! So don't play games with me!
Dude, Jet's voice acting is so funny to me. They really saw Shadow and said we need someone even cooler and edgier sounding, but the result is just weird. Another cool thing about Sonic Riders is it feels like a big celebratory end of an era expression, arriving towards the tail end of 6th Gen, which is the generation that Sega themselves kicked off back in 1999 with the ill-fated Dreamcast. If the Dreamcast did well, then maybe Sonic Riders would have been one of the last games for that system, and its expanded cast of other Sega characters with Ai, Knights and Ulala, as well as the extra Sega-themed levels point towards a sort of carnival feeling, a celebration of this era of Sega properties. It feels like a rap party for the Dreamcast, or maybe more accurately a wake, since the little guy didn't make it all the way to the finish line. These two Sega-themed bonus tracks, Sega Carnival and Sega Illusion, are filled with a lot of love too. Maybe it was just early stages of Sega cataloging their brand ready for Sega Superstars Tennis and Sonic and Sega All-Stars Racing in the coming years. But these are cool little compilations of all sorts of Sega properties from around this time. This game also kind of fits in with a period of time when Nintendo were getting kind of crazy with their GameCube titles. Later in the console's lifespan, before the Wii but too late in its cycle to really get a second wind, there were a bunch of cool titles when their audience was almost exclusively all core fans. I think of like Donkey Kong Jungle Beat, a platformer beat-em-up hybrid that was intended to be played with a DK Bongo controller. There are all sorts of novel Mario spin-offs like Strikers, Superstar Baseball, and who can forget Dance Dance Revolution Mario Mix. Yo, check this out, he's got the moves, dude. We got the first Fire Emblem console game, Star Fox Assault, which remains underrated, and my dude Chibi Robo got his brief time in the spotlight even. A bunch of cool titles that went under the radar due to Nintendo giving less marketing budget to their games around this time. I always saw Sonic Riders as part of this era since I was a GameCube kid, and I can view it as a sort of culmination of the feeling of this generation for me, with the arcadey vibes and maximalist celebratory atmosphere. It could just be nostalgia because around this era was when I first started achieving some sentience and reading video game magazines and stuff, but the game holds up for me today, so who knows. Speaking of magazines, when Sonic Riders was released back in 2006, critics were not exactly hot on it. It's something that's somewhat understandable, as Sonic Riders is a game that rewards more than just a quick playthrough. If you're not willing to wrestle with it and learn to play well, and just want to cruise through it for a review on a deadline, as most reviewers were doing, then I can see it being a frustrating experience. What initially might seem frustrating or convoluted ends up rewarding to try and master. Reading the IGN review, for example, it kind of feels like a surface level overview with criticisms mostly aimed at the idea if Sonic needs to ride a snowboard when he can run fast. The reviewer seems allergic to calling it a hoverboard for some reason. I understand the perspective of this reviewer, but this sort of simple dismissal based on the game's concept and how they perceive the marketing as Sega pushing Sonic into SSX or Tony Hawk styled extreme sports seems short-sighted. You can see why some people would view the extreme sports angle of Riders as trend chasing, especially not long after Shadow the Hedgehog, which of course nowadays we can all laugh at, like that game is the most mid-2000s shit you can imagine. Emphasis on mid, but at the time it seemed like a bit of a weird move made for marketing reasons rather than a deep-rooted desire to further explore Shadow's character. As such, a double whammy of this spin-off title not long after might have gotten people a bit burnt out on Sonic. I guess around this time specifically was when the critical narrative started to shift against Sonic, punctuated later by something else that occurred in 2006, when Sonic would grace the new consoles with the generationally terrible Sonic 06, which was so bad I think it's pretty close to overtaking the Atari ET game to be the de facto game you think of when someone says unfinished or worst game ever. If that wasn't enough, they also put put out one of the worst ports ever of the original Sonic the Hedgehog for GBA in this year as well. Sonic's 15th anniversary did not go according to plan, to say the least. Sonic Riders ends up the best Sonic title from the mid-2000s era, but despite achieving good sales still, I can't help but feel like the lukewarm critic response meant that the original Riders would be doomed to be a one-of-a-kind sort of game. Sonic Riders is a franchise we haven't really seen that much of, but it's a series that's retained a hardcore fanbase over the years, mainly due to the tougher barrier of entry and more detailed mechanics. But there's teams of fans that have made mods for the game. In particular, there's Sonic Riders DX. This is a patch for the game that overhauls it in various ways. You run a regular GameCube ISO of Sonic Riders through their modding tools to patch it into this altered version of the game. They even have a custom version of the Dolphin emulator available that they fine-tuned exactly for Sonic Riders and its sequel, which they've also done a similar improved mod for. It's really going above and beyond out of love for the game. When I checked this mod out, I was blown away by just how much effort was put into it. This isn't just a little tweak to the game to add some quality of life improvements. It's close to the amount of content and polish that you'd expect an official remaster you paid money for to have. Honestly, this kind of dedication isn't an uncommon story among Sonic fans, but I'm going to stick my neck out for and say get a bad rep on the internet. Maybe because arguably the most high-profile Sonic enthusiast isn't a very compelling character, but I think Sonic fans are underrated as one of the most powerful class of people on the internet. Like the way these guys are moving, united via a love for these Blue Hedgehog games, is kind of powerful. People will laugh at Sonic fans, but not take into account how influential they are. Like think of how much power they wield. They got a Hollywood studio to burn through an entire animation studio in order to change the ugly CGI movie Sonic into something more palatable. This sort of deranged superfan activity is something that corporations can only dream of. Like the way Sonic fans mobilize online compared to say like a Mario fan is quite something, and I will salute them for their rabid dedication to the Hedgehog. More seriously, beyond social media influence though, these guys will make original fan games that are close in quality to the stuff that Sega puts out themselves. Or maybe they'll just detach from the Sonic universe altogether to make original titles heavily inspired by Sonic, like Spark the Electric Jester or Freedom Planet, which are both so cool. There's a really rampant spirit of creativity within the Sonic community that I love to see, stretching from simple stuff like the thousands of Blank the Hedgehog OCs and webcomics to entire original fan games or mods. Like whatever video game franchise can the creators put out an absolute dogshit game that the fans will then pick up and say, hey, we got it from here, and fix it themselves. Back to Sonic Riders DX. You can play this with a HD texture pack that not only upscales the graphics but even includes original high quality art for the characters and trick ranks that look great. A lot of the quality of life improvements are based around making the game competitive and esports ready, which means I'd still go for the original base game first instead of skipping straight to mods, as the barrier of entry is higher to start with this. But man, some of the changes they've implemented here makes it hard to go back. It's all been optimized and balanced, so there's not any essential shortcuts or optimal paths. They speed up and automate the set pieces that you previously had to rotate the control stick rapidly for, like you're going for gold in Mario Party. If that's not enough, there's another similar mod called Sonic Riders Tournament Edition that also has a bunch of changes to push the game to being more competitive and balanced. It has similarly increased speed, some extra characters, new skins, and lots of optimizations and quality of life improvements. Tournament Edition feels even faster than DX, but once you get used to it, I think it's the most fun way of playing the game. Landing grinds or nailing a perfect corner with the extra speed just feels great. You can even play as Hatsune Miku in this one, which is arguably starting to feel a little random, but whatever bro, the more the merrier. If I ever have some time to kill but don't want to get sucked into something for an hour or more, then booting up Riders for a couple quick races with one of these mods attached has recently been a go-to for me. In particular, removing the spin the stick set pieces makes quick games of Riders so much more fun. In both Tournament Edition and Sonic Riders DX, they add a bunch of alternate music choices from other Sonic games and sometimes just other games in general to keep things fresh. I gotta say, both teams passed the Pass the Orcs test. I would have no problem handing the Orcs to either of them after seeing their choices of what pairs well with Riders. I only intended a cursory visit to Sonic Riders, but ended up getting sucked back in. With time, I think this has aged pretty well, to end up a distinctive racing game, with elements of Sonic Adventure, Sega arcade games, Dreamcast-era Soul, and Extreme Sports mid-2000s energy. While Sonic Riders has a sequel, it's not as good, simplifying a lot of in-depth mechanics and making it unfortunately feel more like Sonic Kart. Then Sonic and Sega All-Stars Racing completes the process and literally became Sonic Kart. There's also Sonic Free Riders, but that game was literally a scam. There was a time in life where people would pretend they were excited about controlling games by standing in front of a camera and haplessly making motions like this. It's extra unfortunate to see what originally started out as a mechanically dense racing game be devolved into something that's pretty much plays itself, and you stamp the ground and wank off the air to try and get the Kinect camera to recognize your movements. Sonic Riders is a game I can just pop on to grind away at for a little bit, especially given the increased speed and balance of the DX and Tournament editions, which each can make playing this game feel just as fresh as it was in 2006 again, with its maximalist aesthetics, banging arcade-styled soundtrack, and end-of-an-era party-like atmosphere. I think it definitely holds up wonderfully well if you're willing to give it some time to dive in beyond the inaccessible surface. It was unfortunately dismissed on release, but nowadays I think it's aged into being a great curiosity of the late 6th gen.